Do you ever lie awake at night, caught in that perfect, suffocating silence of your own home, and swear you can hear things? Not the house settling, not the distant hum of traffic, but something else entirely. A faint murmur, just beyond the threshold of understanding, that makes the hairs on your arms stand up and your breath catch in your throat. This is the kind of story that makes you check your locks twice before going to bed. It's the kind that lingers, a quiet echo in the back of your mind, long after you've tried to dismiss it. So, before the story truly begins, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, turn off the lights if you dare. Ignore the noises your house makes in the silence. And let's find out together what truly hides in the darkness. The new house felt like a revelation, a genuine breath of fresh air after years spent cooped up in a cramped suburban rental. It was an older place, built sometime in the mid-1940s, nestled on a generous plot of land at the edge of town, bordering a small, dense woods. The real estate agent had called it secluded, which was precisely what I was looking for. No immediate neighbors, just the quiet rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. The peeling paint, the overgrown garden, the slightly crooked porch. To me, they weren't flaws, but character. It was a fixer-upper, yes, but it was mine. The kind of place you could truly make your own, away from the constant hum of other people's lives. I'd spent countless hours dreaming of a spot where the only sounds were the ones I chose to make. Moving day was a blur of boxes and sweat, punctuated by the grunts of the two movers I'd hired and the rhythmic creak of floorboards underfoot. By evening, they were gone, and I stood in my new living room, amidst a sea of cardboard, utterly exhausted but blissfully content. The silence was profound, a thick velvet blanket that wrapped around me. I could hear my own breathing, the soft throb of my pulse in my ears. It was truly empty, truly quiet, and it was glorious. Over the next few days, I slowly began the process of unpacking, dedicating an entire afternoon just to scrubbing down the kitchen, marveling at the original, slightly chipped white ceramic tiles. The house had a solid, reassuring feel, despite its age. The walls, I noticed, were unusually thick, built with a kind of plaster and lath construction that seemed to absorb sound rather than transmit it. This detail at the time was a comfort, promising privacy. It was a good thing, I thought, for a house that was meant to be a sanctuary. This particular construction style, common in homes of that era, used a network of narrow wooden strips, or laths, nailed to the wall studs, which were then covered with multiple layers of plaster, creating a very dense, sound-dampening barrier. I remember thinking how perfect that was for someone who craved solitude. The first week was idyllic. I woke with the sun, drank my coffee on the surprisingly sturdy porch swing, and spent hours just puttering around, planning where furniture would go, which walls needed painting. The air was crisp, the woods silent and inviting. I even took a few walks along the faint deer trails that bordered my property, enjoying the solitude. There was an old, gnarled oak tree at the far corner of my yard, its branches spreading wide like welcoming arms, and I often found myself drawn to its shade. It felt like a sentinel watching over the property. The nights were just as peaceful. I'd fall asleep to the chirping of crickets, an occasional distant owl, and nothing more. The utter lack of city noise was a balm to my soul. I slept deeper than I had in years. It was during the second week, though, that something subtly shifted. It was late afternoon, a Tuesday, I think. I was in the spare bedroom, which I'd decided would be my new office, trying to assemble a flat-pack desk. The instructions were, as always, infuriatingly vague. I was kneeling on the floor, wrestling with an uncooperative screw when I heard it. It wasn't a distinct sound, not at first. More like a faint hum or a vibration just at the edge of audibility. I paused, screwdriver suspended, tilting my head. Was it the refrigerator? No, that was downstairs, and its hum was a familiar, low thrum. This was different. Higher pitched, almost like a faint, distant radio, but without any discernible melody or words. I held my breath, listening intently. It seemed to come from deeper within the walls themselves, or perhaps the floorboards directly beneath me. It was so faint, I almost dismissed it as my imagination, a trick of tired ears. I remember shaking my head slightly, blaming the stress of moving and the stubborn desk. I tightened the screw, gave up on the desk for a moment, and stood up, stretching my aching back. The sound seemed to dissipate instantly, swallowed by the profound silence of the house. I shrugged it off, attributing it to a phantom echo or the residual ringing in my ears from an earlier noise. It was easy to rationalize it away then, in the bright light of a Tuesday afternoon. Maybe it was just the house settling, I told myself. Old houses make noises. That was my initial thought, the comforting rationalization that often accompanies the first hint of something amiss. A slight creak in the night, a distant thud, always easily explained by the house's age, the wind, or even just pipes. This was no different, or so I convinced myself. But then, a couple of nights later, it happened again. I was in bed reading, the only light a soft lamp on my nightstand. The house was completely dark otherwise, utterly still. I remember the exact page I was on, the quiet turning of the paper as I flipped a page. That's when I heard it again. This time it wasn't a hum. It was more like an extremely faint whisper, so soft, so indistinct that it could easily be mistaken for the rustling of leaves outside or the gentle sigh of the wind passing through the old house's eaves. But there was no wind that night. The air was perfectly still. I pulled my book down, my eyes darting to the bedroom door, then to the window. Nothing, just the impenetrable darkness beyond the glass. I strained my ears, holding my breath until my lungs ached. Nothing again, just the almost oppressive silence. My heart rate picked up a barely perceptible beat. A shiver traced its way down my spine, despite the warmth of my blankets. I told myself it was just the wind finally kicking up, or perhaps my mind was playing tricks on me, tired from another day of unpacking. It was the sensible explanation, the one I clung to. The next day I was more alert, more attuned to the sounds of the house. I still didn't hear anything out of the ordinary during the daytime. The house seemed perfectly normal, bathed in sunlight, filled with the sounds of my own activity, the clatter of dishes, the hum of the washing machine, the music I played softly while I worked. My initial unease from the night before seemed silly in the harsh light of day. I even joked to myself about how quickly my imagination was running wild in this isolated setting. Maybe I needed to get out more, visit the town, meet some people. The solitude, which I had so craved, now felt a little too absolute in its quiet embrace. I spent the afternoon painting the small guest bathroom a cheerful shade of blue, brush strokes methodical, the scent of fresh paint filling the air. It was a grounding activity, something normal and tangible. As evening approached, I cooked a simple dinner, the sizzle of food in the pan a comforting domestic sound. But then, as darkness descended once more, the subtle shift returned. I was in the living room, settling down with a cup of tea, the television flickering silently in the background. The low light from the screen cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. The house was quiet again, except for the distant, almost imperceptible murmur. This time, it was harder to ignore. It wasn't a hum. It was definitely a sound that suggested human vocalization, albeit incredibly muted. Like a conversation happening very, very far away, or through multiple layers of thick wall. It wasn't loud enough to distinguish words or even specific tones, but the quality of the sound was unmistakable. It sounded like voices. My breath hitched. I paused the show, the sudden silence of the television amplifying the soft, persistent sound. It was coming from somewhere near the back of the house, perhaps the kitchen or the utility room. I sat perfectly still, listening. It seemed to ebb and flow, sometimes almost disappearing, then returning, a faint, rhythmic drone. It wasn't menacing, not yet, just incredibly odd. I knew I was alone in the house. I had double-checked the locks, walked through every room before dark. There was no one else here. So where was the sound coming from? I stood up slowly, my heart starting to thump an uneven rhythm against my ribs. I walked towards the kitchen, my footsteps unnaturally loud in the quiet house. I stopped in the doorway, listening. The sounds were there, faint, unsettling, like ghosts of words brushing against the fabric of reality. I slowly extended my hand to the light switch, flicking it on, flooding the kitchen with bright, unforgiving light. The sounds, as if startled, vanished instantly, leaving behind only the sterile hum of the refrigerator. I stood there for a long moment, staring into the brightly lit, empty room, my mind grappling with what I had just heard. Was it just the wind, perhaps, funneled through an unseen vent, or maybe a neighbor's distant television, carried by some freak acoustic anomaly? I desperately wanted to believe that. I had to believe that. But the truth was, deep down, a tremor of doubt had begun to take root. This quiet, solitary house was perhaps not as quiet or as solitary as I had so desperately hoped. The strange sounds, initially dismissed, were now starting to demand a certain, unsettling attention. The sanctuary was beginning to feel less like a haven and more like a stage for an unseen audience. The incident in the kitchen, brief and easily rationalized as it was at the time, left a subtle residue of unease. My sleep became lighter, more prone to interruption. I found myself waking in the dead of night, not from a nightmare, but from an almost imperceptible awareness. It was as if a part of my brain had become hypervigilant, constantly scanning the silence for the return of those elusive whispers. During the day, I tried to ignore it, focusing on the renovation work. I painted the living room, sanded down some old floorboards, even managed to successfully assemble that cursed flat-back desk. My hands were busy, my mind occupied with practical tasks. I reasoned that I was simply overtired, perhaps a bit lonely in this new, isolated environment. After all, moving to a completely new place, especially one so removed from previous comforts, could play tricks on the mind. It was a common psychological phenomenon, I told myself, for people in new, unfamiliar surroundings to become overly sensitive to sound. My logical brain was working overtime to dismiss the growing apprehension. But the nights were different. The whispers returned almost nightly, no longer just a faint hum, but clearly, undeniably, voices. They were always low, indistinct, like a radio tune just off frequency, or people talking behind a very thick door. It was impossible to make out individual words, but the cadence, the rhythm of human speech was unmistakable. They seemed to float through the house, sometimes from the living room, sometimes from the hallway, occasionally right outside my bedroom door. I would lie there frozen, straining to understand. Was it one voice, multiple, male, female? I couldn't tell. It was just a constant, maddening murmur, a chorus of unintelligible sound that permeated the stillness. I checked the house repeatedly, every window latched, every door locked. I even went so far as to search for hidden vents or passages, convinced there must be some logical explanation. Perhaps an old intercom system from decades past was subtly picking up signals from afar. I knew that older homes, especially some from the mid-20th century, sometimes had primitive intercoms built into the walls, even if they were now defunct. It was a plausible theory, a straw I desperately clung to. One night the whispers were particularly insistent. I had fallen asleep, but something jolted me awake. The house was utterly dark, save for the sliver of moonlight peeking through a gap in the curtains. And then I heard it right outside my bedroom door. It sounded closer than before, a low, urgent murmur that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. My heart hammered against my ribs. I lay absolutely still, barely breathing, every muscle tensed. It wasn't loud, but it was there. I could feel its presence, a tangible weight in the air, pressing against the silence. It wasn't menacing, not yet, just incredibly present. It felt like watching a silent movie of a conversation, where you can see the lips move but hear no sound. My mind raced through possibilities. A squatter, but I had checked the house so thoroughly. A wild animal. No, this was distinctly human. I slowly, painstakingly, reached for my phone on the nightstand, my fingers trembling slightly. I turned on the flashlight feature, the sudden beam cutting through the darkness. I swung my legs out of bed and crept to the door. My hand hovered over the doorknob. My imagination conjured up all sorts of horrors on the other side. What if someone was there? What if the voices weren't just disembodied sounds, but real people waiting? The thought was terrifying, but the alternative, that I was losing my mind, was perhaps even more so. With a sudden surge of adrenaline, I flung the door open, the flashlight beam sweeping across the empty hallway. Nothing, just the familiar stretch of wood and carpet, bathed in the stark white light. The coat rack stood sentinel by the linen closet, a forgotten scarf draped over it. The whispers, of course, had vanished the instant the door opened. The silence that rushed in was immediate and absolute, almost mocking in its completeness. I stood there for a long moment, flashlight beam trembling slightly in my hand, my breath heavy in the quiet air. Was I hallucinating? Was the isolation truly getting to me? I walked down the hallway, checked the bathroom, the guest bedroom, all empty. I even peered over the railing down into the living room, which was equally deserted. The house was, as it always had been, completely empty save for me. The pattern continued. The whispers would begin after dark, intensify in the dead of night, and vanish the moment I tried to pinpoint their source or turned on a light. It was as if they were shy, or perhaps elusive, deliberately avoiding direct confrontation. I started leaving lights on in hallways, just small lamps, hoping to deter whatever was causing the sounds. It didn't work. The whispers continued, unaffected by the feeble attempts to banish the darkness. I even tried recording them. I'd set my phone to record audio and leave it in different rooms overnight, hoping to capture something tangible. Every morning, I'd play back hours of static, the distant chirping of crickets, the creaks and groans of an old house. But never the whispers. It was maddening. It made me question my own perception, my own sanity. Was I truly hearing them, or was my mind fabricating sounds in the profound silence? This element of ambiguity was tormenting me. I knew what I heard, yet I couldn't prove it even to myself. I began to research similar phenomena, old house noises, auditory hallucinations, even obscure local legends. I found nothing that precisely matched my experience. One article mentioned something called sleep paralysis with auditory hallucinations, but I was always fully awake when I heard the voices. Another detailed exploding head syndrome, a benign but startling condition where one hears a loud, sudden noise upon falling asleep or waking, but my sounds were soft, continuous, conversational. I even briefly considered that a faulty electrical system might be picking up radio waves, but the distinct vocal quality of the sounds argued against that. It was like a constant, low-grade fever of anxiety gnawing at the edges of my perception. I found myself becoming more withdrawn, less inclined to leave the house, yet paradoxically, more desperate for outside contact. I started making long, rambling phone calls to friends and family, trying to sound normal, trying to cling to the normalcy that was slowly eroding. My days became a cycle of routine tasks punctuated by moments of intense, strained listening. I'd pause mid-task, head cocked, trying to discern if that faint murmur was just the refrigerator cycling or something else. I'd sometimes catch myself unconsciously holding my breath, my muscles tensed, waiting. I even started playing music during the day, louder than I normally would, just to drown out the possibility of hearing them. But the nights were unavoidable. The whispers would seep into the quiet hours, a persistent, flowing current of sound. Sometimes, I swear I could almost make out a word, just a syllable, an intonation that hinted at meaning, only for it to dissolve into static the moment I focused. It was like trying to catch smoke in a net. I started to dread going to bed, not because I was afraid I would hear them, but because I was afraid I wouldn't, and that would mean I was truly losing my mind. The absence of something I knew was there felt worse, somehow, than its presence. One evening, I was in the living room, trying to relax with a movie. It was a light-hearted comedy, something designed to distract. The volume was up, perhaps a little too loud, but I wanted to feel surrounded by normal, understandable sound. Suddenly, through the film's upbeat dialogue and soundtrack, I heard it, clearer than before. Not loud, but it cut through the noise with an almost surgical precision. It was coming from the wall behind the television, a whispering that sounded like multiple voices, layered over each other, a soft cacophony of hushed tones. My breath hitched. I slowly, almost reverently, reached for the remote and paused the movie. The sudden silence was deafening, save for the distinct, flowing murmur from the wall. It was undeniably there, closer, more defined. It wasn't just a general sound now. It seemed to be specifically located, like a low-frequency hum that vibrated the very air, but carried with it the ghost of human intent. I stood up, my eyes fixed on the wall behind the TV. It was just a plain wall, painted recently, no apparent vents or openings, nothing that would explain this. The whispers were swirling, intermingling, a quiet, almost suffocating presence. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't the house settling. This was something else. This was a chorus, and they were trying to say something. The fear was no longer a distant tremor. It was starting to solidify, to take on shape and form, pressing in on me from the very fabric of the house. I could feel the cold dread blossoming in my stomach, the realization that whatever this was, it wasn't going away. It was only getting stronger. The whispers behind the television wall weren't just a faint backdrop anymore. They had intensified, becoming a pervasive, almost physical presence. It was as if a membrane had thinned, allowing more of their insidious current to seep into my reality. Sitting there, movie paused, I stared at the seemingly innocuous wall, the cheerful blue paint now seeming terribly out of place. The sounds were a low, constant hum of voices, a soft drone of conversation that stretched and contracted, sometimes rising to a barely discernible crescendo, only to fall back into a maddening, indistinct murmur. What made it worse was the sheer multiplicity of them. It wasn't one voice, but several, interwoven like a complex, horrifying tapestry of sound. I couldn't make out words, but the sheer volume of perceived activity was unsettling. It felt like a small, crowded room was situated directly on the other side of that wall, filled with people exchanging hushed secrets. I spent the rest of that night on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, unable to sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside seemed amplified, imbued with a sinister meaning. The whispers continued their relentless symphony from the living room wall, a constant reminder that I was not alone. It was psychological torture. I imagined countless scenarios, a hidden room, a faulty wire picking up neighbors' conversations from miles away, even a prank by some local teenagers, but each one crumbled under scrutiny. There were no hidden rooms I could find, no obvious wire faults, and the house was far too isolated for teenagers to be playing such an elaborate, long-running trick. The fear began to shift from a vague unease to a cold, hard certainty. Whatever this was, it was within the house, and it certainly wasn't normal. My sleep schedule completely evaporated. I'd typically drift off around midnight, only to be jolted awake at 2 a.m. or 3 a.m., not by a sudden noise, but by the subtle, creeping feeling of being watched, immediately followed by the resurgence of the whispers. They seemed to pick up their pace and clarity in the darkest hours. One night, I woke feeling a distinct chill in the air, despite my thermostat being set to a comfortable temperature. It was a cold spot, almost like a draft, but it was centered not around a window, but directly in the middle of my bedroom. And from that very spot, the whispers seemed to emanate with a chilling clarity. It wasn't just vague murmurings anymore. I heard a low, almost guttural sigh, then a series of what sounded like rapid, clipped syllables. Still no discernible words, but the tone was different. Before they had felt like distant chatter. Now they felt close, intimate, and unsettlingly interested. This inexplicable cold spot, which seemed to travel with the whispers, became a terrifying precursor to their intensification. It was a detail I couldn't shake, a coldness that wasn't just physical but seeped into my bones. I tried everything to block them out. I slept with earplugs, then noise-canceling headphones playing white noise. For a few nights, this offered a modicum of relief, a temporary respite from the constant assault on my senses. But then, the insidious nature of the sounds began to adapt. They didn't get louder, not exactly. Instead, they seemed to penetrate the barriers. The white noise would suddenly feel thin, inadequate, as if the whispers were seeping through the very fabric of the sound, a ghostly undertone that vibrated just beneath the surface of the static. Even with the headphones firmly pressed against my ears, I could still feel their presence, a low thrumming behind my eyes, a pressure in my temples. It was as if they weren't just auditory, but something tactile, something that bypassed the ears entirely and resonated directly within my skull. This made me question my perception more than ever. Was I truly hearing them? Or was the psychological strain so immense that my brain was simply expecting them, creating phantom echoes even when no sound was present? The ambiguity was a cruel tormentor, leaving me no firm ground to stand on. During the day, I became obsessed with finding a logical explanation. I went into town and bought a stud finder, convinced there was a hidden cavity in the wall, maybe a forgotten dumbwaiter shaft or an unused chimney flue that was acting as a sound conduit. I spent hours methodically scanning every wall in the living room, then the adjacent kitchen, then even the upstairs bedrooms. The stud finder beeped reliably, marking the wooden studs behind the plaster, but revealed no unusual voids. I even chipped away a small section of plaster in an inconspicuous corner of the utility room, hoping to find some telltale sign of a hidden space or a structural anomaly. What I found was dense, solid plaster, backed by old, seasoned timber studs. Nothing that explained how sound could travel so freely or originate from within the walls themselves. My grounding detail for this period was the absolute frustrating solidity of the house's construction. I learned that many houses built in the 1940s, especially those meant to last, often utilized a method of construction known as balloon framing, where studs run continuously from the foundation to the roof, creating potential vertical channels for sound and air. However, even with balloon framing, the density of the plaster walls I was dealing with should have muffled external sounds almost entirely, not allowed internal, mysterious ones to propagate so clearly. It was a contradiction that gnawed at me. One afternoon, I was cleaning the antique fireplace in the living room, scrubbing away decades of soot and grime when the whispers started. It was still daylight, a bright, sunny afternoon. This was new. They had always been a nocturnal phenomenon before. My heart leaped into my throat. They were coming from the fireplace itself, a low, guttural murmur that seemed to rise from deep within the chimney flue. I froze, my hand clutching a sooty rag. The sound was unmistakably there, a malevolent drone that felt like a coiled threat. It wasn't just random sounds anymore. It felt like something was active within the house, something that was beginning to assert its presence, even in the light of day. I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on the dark maw of the fireplace. The sounds continued, a soft, roiling rumble that raised goosebumps on my arms. The whispers began to follow me. If I went into the kitchen, they would seem to subtly shift, becoming more prominent from that direction. If I went upstairs to the bathroom, I would hear them from the hallway outside, or even from the pipes in the walls. It was subtle, insidious, and utterly terrifying. It was as if whatever was causing the whispers was aware of my movements, tracking me, always just out of sight, always just out of reach. It was no longer just ambient noise. It was an invisible companion, an unseen presence that shadowed my every step. The paranoia was absolute. I started talking to myself, arguing with the air, desperate for a human voice, even my own, to break the oppressive silence. I tried to reason with nothing, to plead with the unseen. "What do you want?" I'd whisper into the empty rooms, my voice cracking with desperation. The only response was the steady, maddening murmur. This escalation of personal impact was the most chilling aspect. It wasn't just a house making strange noises anymore. It felt like a deliberate psychological attack. I began to feel their presence watching me, a cold intelligence behind the unintelligible sounds. I couldn't relax, couldn't focus. My appetite vanished. My nights were spent in a state of suspended terror, catching only brief, exhausted snatches of sleep that were invariably interrupted by the whisper. It got to the point where I genuinely started questioning my own sanity. Was I truly hearing this, or was I cracking under the pressure of isolation and an overactive imagination? The lines blurred, and I felt myself slipping closer and closer to that edge. The thought that I might be going insane was almost as terrifying as the idea that there was truly something else in the house. This was the most profound element of ambiguity, the terror of losing my mind amidst the terror of the unknown. One night, the whispers were louder than ever, a frantic, overlapping chorus that seemed to fill the entire bedroom. I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. It sounded like a multitude of voices, urgent, agitated, just on the cusp of clarity. As I listened, trembling, a single phrase, so fleeting, so soft, seemed to coalesce from the cacophony. It was only 3 words, barely a whisper, yet it cut through the noise with chilling precision. "Get out, get out." The words hung in the air, cold and stark, undeniable. My breath hitched, a freezing wave of terror washing over me. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't the house settling. This was a direct command, and it was meant for me. "Get out, get out." The words, though barely a whisper, had pierced through the frantic chorus of voices and slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. They weren't just ambient noise anymore. They were a direct, undeniable command. My breath hitched, a freezing wave of terror washing over me, colder than any cold spot. For weeks, I had clung to the frayed edges of sanity, battling the terrifying ambiguity of whether I was hearing things or losing my mind. But this was different. This was a direct, intelligible message. There was no rationalizing it away, no faulty wiring, no distant radio waves, no overactive imagination could produce such a clear, concise instruction. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs, echoing the urgency of the unseen voices. The air in the room felt thick, heavy, charged with an invisible presence that was no longer content to simply observe. It wanted me gone, and it had finally found its voice. I spent the remainder of that night huddled in my bed, wide awake, the whispers swirling around me like a tempest of sound. They were no longer just a murmur. They felt agitated, almost triumphant, as if my understanding of their message had given them power. I could almost feel their collective gaze on me, pressing down, willing me to comply. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of the leaves outside, seemed to become part of their chorus, a mocking symphony of sound designed to drive me to the brink. I remember the moonlight casting stark shadows on the bedroom wall, transforming familiar objects into grotesque figures. I stared at them, my eyes aching, desperate for the first sliver of dawn. When the sun finally rose, painting the room in soft, hopeful light, the whispers, as always, receded, leaving behind a profound, aching silence. But this time it was not a comforting silence. It was the silence of a predator, resting, waiting. My resolve hardened in the daylight. The fear was still there, a constant knot in my stomach, but it was now laced with a desperate need for answers. I couldn't just live with this. I couldn't run without understanding. If these whispers were real, then something was causing them. And if that something wanted me out, I needed to know what I was up against. My initial thoughts had been about paranormal entities, ghosts, spirits, lingering echoes of past inhabitants. But Get Out felt too deliberate, too focused for a mere echo. It felt like something with intent, with agency. This shift in my perception was profound. I was no longer an observer, but a direct target. The element of ambiguity now was not if something was there, but what it was and why it wanted me gone. I began a methodical, almost frantic search of the house, no longer looking for simple structural explanations, but for anything out of place, anything that felt wrong. I tore up sections of carpet, specifically in the living room where the whispers had been strongest. I pried off baseboards, peered into every dusty corner of the attic and crawl space. Nothing. Just the expected grime and cobwebs of an old house. I even started tapping on walls, listening for hollow spots, convinced there must be a hidden room, a secret compartment that contained the source of this torment. I remembered an old architectural feature, commonly used in houses of this age, called a speaking tube, sometimes installed between floors or rooms for communication before modern intercom. While largely obsolete by the 1940s, a rudimentary or experimental one could potentially exist. I desperately looked for any small circular opening, any sign of such a system. It was a long shot, but I clung to any physical explanation. My search led me back to the living room, specifically to the wall behind the television and the old fireplace. I'd noticed before that the fireplace seemed to be active, even when no fire was lit. It had a faint, lingering scent, not of smoke, but something musty, damp, and old. It was a subtle detail I dismissed as just the smell of an old chimney. Now I saw it differently. I ran my hands over the brickwork, feeling for any loose mortar, any hidden seams. It was solid, unremarkable. But as I leaned closer, my ear pressed against the cold bricks, I heard it again. A faint, almost imperceptible scratching, then several voices, not get out this time, but a swirling, chaotic murmur, as if the sounds were trapped, struggling against some unseen barrier. The foresight of this observation now seemed chillingly precise. The fireplace, once a comforting focal point, now felt like a gaping maw. I spent hours dismantling the non-functional fireplace, piece by painstakingly slow piece. I removed the grate, then used a pry bar to loosen the decorative mantle. Dust and debris rained down, thick and suffocating. As I worked, the whispers around me seemed to intensify, shifting from indistinct murmurs to what sounded like frantic, overlapping pleas. It was as if I was disturbing something, agitating it. The cold spots in the room became more pronounced, swirling around me like invisible currents. The air grew heavy, almost difficult to breathe. I ignored the growing dread, driven by a desperate need for answers. My hands were sore, my clothes filthy, but I couldn't stop. I had to know. I had to find the source. This relentless, almost pathological drive to uncover the truth, despite the terror, was the only thing keeping me going. Finally, after hours of grueling work, I managed to remove a section of the plasterboard that had encased the original brickwork of the chimney. Behind it, in a small, damp recess, almost hidden by decades of dust and debris, was a small cavity. It wasn't a hidden room, nor was it a speaking tube. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, neatly stacked, were several small, aged wooden boxes. They looked like old cigar boxes, or perhaps antique tea caddies. They were unmarked, plain, and unnervingly old. And from the moment I exposed them, the whispers in the room became a roar, a cacophony of urgent, distressed voices that felt like they were screaming directly into my skull. The sheer volume was unbearable, a chaotic symphony of agony and anger. It was as if I had opened a Pandora's box of sound. My hands trembled as I reached for the nearest box. It felt surprisingly light. I pulled it out, my eyes darting frantically around the room, half expecting something to materialize, to erupt from the walls. The box was made of dark, unvarnished wood, held shut by a tiny, rusted clasp. My fingers fumbled with it, the whispers around me peaking in their intensity, a horrifying crescendo of sound. With a sharp click, the clasp opened. I lifted the lid, my breath catching in my throat. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like dried herbs and desiccated fragments of bone, were small, tightly rolled scrolls of parchment, bound with thin, brittle string. There were perhaps a dozen of them, each no bigger than my thumb. As I carefully picked one up, a faint, acrid smell, like old linen and something else, something vaguely metallic and bitter, rose from the box. It was a smell I had never encountered before, yet it felt profoundly ancient and wrong. I unrolled the first scroll with trembling fingers. The parchment was yellowed and fragile, the ink faded but still legible. It was a single word, handwritten in a spidery, almost frantic script, repeated over and over again, filling the tiny scroll from top to bottom. The word was fear, and as I read it, a cold, piercing whisper, distinct from the agitated chorus, burrowed directly into my mind, clear as a bell. "We are here. Listen." My blood turned to ice. This wasn't just a random sound. This was a deliberate, malevolent collection. The other boxes contained similar scrolls, each repeating a single, powerful, negative emotion: anger, sorrow, despair. And a few, more chillingly, bore the name of a person followed by a single, crushing word. John Guilt, Mary Grief. This was it. This was the terrifying revelation. The house wasn't just haunted, it was a depository. The whispers weren't echoes, they were the trapped essences, the collected residue of human emotion and perhaps human souls. The very fabric of the house seemed to pulse with the contained energy of these fear archives. It was a horrifying, almost unthinkable discovery, far beyond any ghost story I had ever heard. The walls weren't just thick, they were designed to contain, to hold something within. I looked at the dark opening in the wall, then back at the small, innocuous boxes. It wasn't just old house noises. It was a prison, and I had just opened a cell. "We are here. Listen," the whispered command, crystal clear in my mind, resonated with a horrifying truth that transcended mere sound. It wasn't just my imagination conjuring a phantom voice. It was an undeniable, direct communication from whatever malevolence had been dormant within those boxes. The sheer implications threatened to shatter my composure. The house was not just old, not just a fixer-upper. It was a carefully constructed receptacle, possibly a prison, for concentrated human suffering. My hands, still clutching the first scroll with the word fear, repeated endlessly, began to tremble uncontrollably. The collected essences of forgotten terrors, resentments, and sorrows were not merely contained. They were now awake, and they were speaking. The cacophony of whispers that had raged when I first exposed the cavity now intensified, swirling around me, no longer just sounds but sensation. I felt pressure on my eardrums, a cold, cloying touch on my skin, and an overwhelming wave of despair that washed over me, threatening to drown me in its icy depths. It felt like every negative emotion ever felt within these walls, amplified 1,000-fold, was now screaming directly into my soul. I dropped the scroll, my gaze fixed on the small, dark opening in the wall, then back to the array of antique boxes. Each one, I realized with sickening clarity, was a jar holding a specific poison. The old cigar box, the antique tea caddy, innocent containers for everyday items, now revealed as vessels of concentrated anguish. The understanding was so profound, so utterly horrifying, that for a moment I couldn't move. My mind reeled. This wasn't a ghost. This was something far more ancient, far more deliberate. A ritual, perhaps. A dark legacy left by a previous tormented inhabitant. I remembered researching the history of the house, but the records were sparse, only listing names and dates of ownership, nothing hinting at a past so sinister. This detail, the mundane historical record contrasted with the supernatural horror, grounded me briefly in the desperate search for reason. How could such a thing be? Yet the overwhelming sensory assault was undeniable. As if my thoughts had unleashed a new torrent, the whispers exploded in volume. They were no longer just indistinct. I could hear fragmented words, overlapping, distorted, yet undeniably there. Betrayed, alone, never again. Mine, not one voice, but a chorus of tortured souls, each screaming its particular agony. The air grew frigid, so cold that I could see my own breath misting in front of me, even though the furnace was running. A heavy, cloying scent like stale blood and damp earth filled my nostrils, turning my stomach. It was the same metallic, bitter scent from the box, but magnified, pervasive. The light fixture above me flickered wildly, the bulb buzzing with a frantic energy, casting jumping shadows that danced like malevolent figures on the walls. Objects on the mantelpiece, untouched for weeks, rattled violently, Then one of the small porcelain figurines toppled over and shattered on the hearth with a sharp, sickening crack. This was it. The house was no longer merely making noises. It was actively responding, actively attacking. The entities bound within the boxes were now truly unleashed. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the growing chaos. I looked at the boxes, at the scrolls within, and a desperate, primal urge to destroy them surged through me. If they were the source, if they were the prison, then smashing them must be the key to stopping this. I reached for the nearest box, my fingers numb with terror and adrenaline. But as I touched the aged wood, a searing cold shot up my arm, so intense it felt like fire. I recoiled with a gasp, pulling my hand back, clutching it to my chest. The whispers coiled around me, a distinct, mocking sneer audible amongst the cacophony. Fool. It was a singular voice, clear and resonant, directly in my mind. You opened it. You released us. Panic, cold and absolute, began to set in. This wasn't a fight I could win with a pry bar or a flashlight. Whatever I had awakened, it was ancient, powerful, and now fully aware of my presence. The objects in the room began to shift more violently. A heavy armchair scraped across the floor with a groan, as if being dragged by an unseen force. The curtains by the window billowed inward, though the window was firmly shut. It was like a poltergeist, but with a horrifying, intelligent malice behind it. A sudden, sharp pain flared in my chest, a crushing pressure that stole my breath. It wasn't physical, not truly, but a psychic assault, a concentrated wave of the very emotions contained in those boxes. I felt fear, pure and undiluted, surge through my veins, mixed with a profound, soul-crushing despair. My legs buckled, and I fell to my knees, gasping for air, clutching my chest. As I struggled for breath, the whispers intensified, focusing now. It was no longer a general chorus, but individual voices, distinct and terrifying. You let us out, one rasped, seemingly from behind me. You will suffer, hissed another from the shadows near the fireplace. And then a child's voice, small and mournful, whispered, it hurts so much. The sound of that child's voice twisted the knife of terror in my gut. This was too much. This was beyond anything I could comprehend or fight. My element of ambiguity here was whether these were true, independent entities, or merely the concentrated psychic residue of the emotions, given a semblance of consciousness by their release. The question of their true nature, whether they were ghosts or something far stranger, remained a terrifying unknown. I scrambled backward, crawling away from the opening in the wall, away from the boxes that now seemed to pulse with dark energy. My mind screamed at me to get out, to run. This was no longer my sanctuary. It was a cage, and the bars were dissolving around me. As I tried to push myself up, a sudden, powerful force slammed into my back, sending me sprawling forward. I cried out, my head hitting the polished wooden floor with a dull thud. Dazed, I looked up. The room was a swirling vortex of cold air and frantic shadows. The whispers were a deafening roar now, enveloping me, twisting into my very thoughts. I could hear my own name, distorted, drawn out, whispered by multiple voices in hideous harmony. Stay with us. The words were an anchor pulling me down into the abyss, but a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, fueled by pure, unadulterated survival instinct, propelled me forward. I crawled, then stumbled towards the front door, the unseen forces buffeting me, trying to hold me back. Furniture seemed to shift, blocking my path, but I pushed through, driven by an almost animalistic need to escape. My vision blurred, tears of terror streaming down my face, mixing with the dust and grime. The air grew heavier, pressing down on my lungs, making each breath a struggle. The whispers were now a continuous scream in my head, raw and agonizing. I could feel icy fingers brushing against my skin, hear distorted laughter, the sounds of scratching coming from the walls themselves, as if 1,000 nails were dragging across plaster. I reached the front door, my hands fumbling desperately with the deadbolt. It seemed to resist, as if held in place by an invisible grip. The whispers surged, a final deafening wave. You belong to us now. With a primal scream, I threw my entire weight against the door, turning the lock with a desperate, grunting effort. The bolt clicked open. I yanked the door inward with a force born of pure terror, stumbling onto the porch, gasping for the cool night air. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I just ran. Down the porch steps, across the overgrown lawn, past the old oak tree that now seemed to loom like a skeletal guardian. I ran into the darkness of the country road, not caring where I was going, just knowing I had to get as far away from that house and the horrors I had unleashed within its walls as humanly possible. The echoes of the screams, the laughter, and the chilling promise, "You belong to us now," chased me into the night, a new, permanent collection of whispers now forming inside my own mind. My sanctuary had become my tomb, and I had barely escaped with my life, leaving a part of my sanity, and perhaps something else, trapped forever within its terrifying archives. I didn't stop running until my lungs ached, a searing fire in my chest that momentarily eclipsed the terror in my mind. The cool night air whipped past my face, a desperate balm against the invisible assaults I still felt pressing against me. My legs pumped mechanically, carrying me further and further down the dark, unlit country road, away from the looming silhouette of the house and the horrors I had unleashed. I didn't have a destination, just an overwhelming, primal need for distance. Every rustle in the dense woods that bordered the road, every distant sound, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through me, my mind still conjuring the chorus of tortured voices, the unseen hands that had pushed me, the chilling promise. "You belong to us now." I ran until I physically couldn't anymore, until my legs buckled beneath me, and I collapsed onto the gravel shoulder, gasping, sobbing, shivering uncontrollably. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, curled into a ball, shaking from cold, exhaustion, and sheer terror. The sounds of the night, crickets, a distant owl, seemed to mock me with their natural rhythm. My mind, however, was still a maelstrom of screaming whispers. Even out here, under the vast, indifferent sky far from the house, I could still hear them, faintly like an echo, but undeniably there, reverberating in the hollow space left where my sanity once resided. It was a terrifying realization. The house might be behind me, but the horror had somehow imprinted itself upon me. It was no longer just in the walls, it was in my head. A new permanent archive of sound and feeling etched onto my consciousness. After what felt like hours, I managed to pull myself together enough to walk. I kept walking, every muscle screaming in protest, until I saw the distant, flickering neon sign of a roadside motel. It was a dive, but at that moment it was a beacon of safety, a flimsy barrier against the consuming darkness of the night. The motel room was sterile, impersonal, and blessedly silent. I locked the door, then chained it, then pushed a chair against it for good measure. I peeled off my filthy, sweat-soaked clothes, shivering under the thin covers of the bed. Sleep didn't come. How could it? Every time I closed my eyes, the whispers surged, a chaotic symphony of fear, anger, sorrow, and that chilling "get out," followed by the ominous "you belong to us now." The faces of John and Mary, whose names I had seen on those scrolls, flashed in my mind, coupled with the crushing weight of their guilt and grief. I could feel the residual cold radiating from my body, an internal chill that clung to me like a shroud. I spent the night staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the ancient air conditioner, trying desperately to distinguish its mechanical drone from the insidious murmurs in my own head. The next day was a blur of phone calls. I called a friend, incoherent at first, then trying to explain in fragmented sentences what had happened. They listened patiently, their voice tinged with concern, likely attributing my distress to stress, isolation, or a nervous breakdown. I called the police, but what could I tell them? That my house was whispering, that I'd found boxes of bottled despair. They'd certainly send a patrol car, but what would they find? An empty house, perhaps a broken fireplace, and a clearly distressed, possibly delusional property owner. The concept of trying to explain sentient, trapped emotions within a hidden wall cavity felt absurd even to me now, in the harsh light of morning, removed from the immediate terror. This was my grounding detail for this period. the frustrating, isolating inability to articulate a supernatural horror to a world that only understands the tangible and the logical. How do you report a haunting that has, by all appearances, become a psychological affliction? I never went back to the house, not physically at least. I tried to arrange for a remote appraisal, an estate agent to handle the sale, anything to sever my ties completely. But the legal and financial practicalities of abandoning a newly purchased property are immense, especially one where I had just started renovations. The estate agent who initially sold me the house was polite but confused. She suggested I take some time, perhaps consider renting it out for a year to clear my head. It's a beautiful, quiet property, she'd said, oblivious to the terror it contained. The thought of anyone else stepping foot in that house, opening those walls, unleashing what I had barely escaped, filled me with a fresh wave of panic. I couldn't bring myself to actively put another person in that danger. So for now, the house sits empty, legally mine, but utterly abandoned. A black mark on my financial records, but a necessary sacrifice for my continued survival. The whispers never fully stopped. They became my constant companion, a low-frequency hum beneath the surface of my consciousness. Sometimes they were just background noise, a faint echo. Other times, especially when I was tired or alone, or when darkness fell, they would surge clearer, closer, weaving fragmented words and emotions into my thoughts. Alone, fear, mine. I tried therapy, explaining away my anxiety and insomnia as consequences of moving to a new, isolated area and the stress of renovations. I never mentioned the whispers directly. How could I? I started wearing noise-canceling headphones almost constantly, even in my new, small apartment in a busy city. The constant drone of urban life, the sirens, the traffic, the chatter of neighbors was a welcome cacophony, a shield against the insidious silence that still threatened to envelop me, bringing the whispers with it. I found myself increasingly drawn to studying old houses, arcane folklore, anything that might shed light on what I had experienced. I devoured books on ley lines, spiritual prisons, and the concept of imprinted trauma in inanimate objects. I learned about old traditions, often forgotten, of binding spirits or emotions to physical objects, sometimes to contain them, sometimes to harness them. It was a chilling revelation, suggesting that what I had stumbled upon wasn't unique, but a dark practice with a long, hidden history. This was my foreshadowing detail, the creeping suspicion that the Fear Archives phenomenon wasn't a one-off, but something potentially much older and more widespread, hinting that similar horrors might exist elsewhere, unseen. Could other houses, seemingly normal, contain such hidden prisons of the soul? Years have passed since I fled that house. I've rebuilt my life, found a new place, a new routine. I try to live a normal existence, but the whispers are always there. A low, persistent thrumming in the quiet moments. They're not as loud or as aggressive as they were that final night, but they're a permanent part of me now, a constant reminder of what I found and what I unleashed. Sometimes late at night, when the city outside finally quiets, I swear I can hear a single, distinct phrase cutting through the noise in my mind. Not a command this time, but a chilling observation. You took us with you. And that's the ultimate terror. Not that the house is still out there, filled with its silent voices, but that a piece of its horror, a fragment of those unsettling archives, might have latched onto me, followed me, and is now simply waiting for its moment to awaken fully once more. The element of ambiguity is no longer about the house, but about myself. Am I truly safe, or have I become a living vessel for the very essence I sought to escape? The silence, in the end, became my most constant tormentor. Not the absence of sound, but the expectation of it. The way a quiet room will suddenly feel heavy, pregnant with unspoken words, even if no discernible sound breaks the stillness. I still find myself listening, straining, a subtle habit born of terror that now feels irrevocably woven into my being. The world outside moves on, oblivious. People laugh, cars pass, birds sing. But beneath it all, for me, there is that persistent hum, a faint, almost imperceptible static of voices. I sometimes wonder about the house. Does it still stand, silent and ordinary to the casual observer, its forgotten horrors still concealed within its walls? Or did my intrusion, my naive curiosity, truly unleash something that permeates the very air around it? I don't know, and I can't bring myself to find out. The memory of that crushing despair, that suffocating fear, that cold, raw anger, it's all still too vivid, too real. It's like a wound that never truly heals, always a dull ache beneath the surface, threatening to flare up at the slightest provocation. I tried to convince myself it was all a delusion, a stress-induced hallucination, a terrible nightmare brought on by isolation and an overactive imagination. But then I remember the cold spot, the shattering figurine, the distinct, metallic smell, and those words, "You belong to us now." And most chillingly, the lingering whisper I still hear in the deepest quiet. You took us with you. It's not a question anymore. It's a quiet, unsettling certainty that the archives, the pieces of bottled human agony, are not confined to that house. They are part of me now, a silent, perpetual echo, ensuring that I am never